Hello everyone and welcome to the Process Podcast. Liam Carmichael, welcome to the studio.
Good afternoon, Ed.
How's your day been, Liam?
My day's been very good. It's been a few ups and downs. Started off really well. Started off with some programming this morning. Had my morning routine. Came into work and went for a coffee with Ed and Alex outside, and then it all turned.
All went downhill.
Yeah, it all went downhill.
I'll update you on my day up until that point as well. Had another good sleep. Had 3 days of good sleeps now after many not so good sleeps. I know we've been talking about it, but just some context for listeners. I'm on a low FODMAP diet at the moment because I noticed that my gut was a little bit inflamed. Hasn't been quite right since the CrossFit Open and quarterfinals. I know that was many moons ago, but I decided it's time to actually try to intervene in some way. Noticing a lot of improvements already. If you have questions about the low FODMAP diet and why I'm doing it, I'd be more than happy to share. So good night's sleep, woke up feeling refreshed, energized, did a really great stint of programming at home, went and sat outside my building where the sun was beating down with the birds in the background tweeting, had a 15-minute meditation, took the MTR into work, stumbled across you and Al sitting outside a coffee shop, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to join them for I can't drink coffee on this current elimination diet I'm doing. So I had an iced matcha tea. And it was a nice 15 minutes. It was before training. The sun was shining. We feel like we're on holiday in Europe right now.
It's like a European summer.
We did, yeah.
Sitting outside in the terrace.
The sun was beaming straight into the coffee shop, having a good chin wag. We had taken our t-shirts off just because, well, actually, you two had taken your tops off already. I thought, I'm definitely getting involved in this.
Straight away when that sun's shining, t-shirts off.
Anyway, we stroll into the gym, having an awesome session with the team, and then I think we were probably about into the last segment of our Wednesday LPCs.
We literally had about 3 minutes left on the clock.
3 minutes to go, and we had someone walk into our gym. We actually saw the police were hovering outside our gym for quite a while, but weren't really doing anything. We weren't sure if it was to do with us or they were dealing with someone else. But then eventually, a man entered the gym. Isabel went to greet him, and he wasn't the most friendly of people. So Izzy had called me over. So reluctantly stopped my workout halfway, came to greet this young chap, and he was rather livid, rather angry.
He was very angry when he came.
Angry.
I actually thought he was an undercover police guy because he was like very angry and emotions were all over the place. Yeah.
So he came at me all guns blazing, and basically had pulled his phone out and just showed me a picture of us having coffee together, and with our masks, which weren't on our faces, which is totally right. Our masks weren't on our faces because we were drinking coffee, sat outside a coffee shop on the coffee shop stairs, coffee shop benches. Anyway, so I go outside and speak to himself and the policeman. He's called the police and reported us with the evidence of this photo of us not having our masks on, and essentially, then he asks who the two colleagues who are sitting with me, and he actually says, I know they're in there in the gym. So unfortunately, just so you know, I didn't rat you guys out. I said, yes, they are two of my coaches, two of my fellow colleagues. I'll go and get them. So we had to provide our ID cards. The three policemen were actually very amicable.
They were actually quite nice people.
Very nice people. They're just doing their jobs. And this guy, had essentially called to report us, and it ended up being probably the most expensive coffee or matcha tea that we ever purchased. 5,000 Hong Kong dollars each.
Very expensive.
That's $15,000.
And the funny thing is, Al didn't even have a coffee. I think he's in an Aquarius in his hand that he bought from Welcome. Yeah. So rather expensive Aquarius, but hey, such is life, right? Quite annoying, but
I had some time to decompress and have a little think about it. I know Al is still fuming and still livid 6 hours later. I'd interested to hear, how did you process all of that, and how are you feeling about it now?
I think I was kind of just in shock. I mean, I think we always talk about API, right? We talk about that and assume positive intent, and I know where the guy was coming from. I get it, but I think there's two ways to go about it. It could one way could have just been up. Hey, he could have come up. Hey guys, because bearing in mind this guy apparently has been filming us for about 15-20 minutes, right? Which is quite rude as well. Someone just filming you without you knowing. He could have just come up and said, "Hey guys, do you mind putting your mask on?" Yeah, sweet. But somehow it escalated to this guy storming in the gym, all guns blazing.
An hour and a half later,
3 policemen were there. Bit strange. Quite disappointed that it escalated to that point. Like I said, he could have just come up and said, "Hey guys, do you mind popping your mask on?" Yeah, sweet. Unfortunately, it went into that situation. mean, I think we had a good conversation with the police. We were actually joking with them. They were asking about protein shakes, etc. They've seen Ed's muscles and that guy must work out.
Yeah. Well, he was like, why aren't you taking protein shakes? You need it, mate.
So yeah, I just had a good conversation with the police guy, but also this gentleman was still very angry. I mean, that's his choice to be angry. Nothing really else I can do about it. Unfortunate it is $5,000. I will probably dispute it because it was the evidence of us sitting at a table, and just by the Hong Kong rules, you are allowed to do that. So I think there's a misinterpretation on his side, and yeah, bit disappointed. But hey, life happens, and we just move on, right? I'm not going to waste my time being angry and upset and all that energy. He can do that. That's fine if he wants to spend his energy doing that, but I will not do that.
Yeah.
Right. I'll take it as it comes. Sweet. Move on. All good.
Nice. Yeah, I felt in the moment, it was because of the moment of essentially this guy coming in and a kind of essentially individually attacking me and calling me out with no context whatsoever. Yeah. So the communication wasn't the clearest from the start. So immediately I was not defensive, but just more on guard, like trying to think like, shit, what have I done? Trying to retrace the steps as to what I might have done to offend this or anger this guy so much. And then obviously very quickly realizing, what he's there for and why I'm in this position. But I think I was able to get quite rational quite fast and realize, you know what? The law is the law. The law is there for a reason. Yep. And it does a lot of good things. And I'm very fortunate for law in many ways. I'm very fortunate for policemen. I think just the disappointment is the disappointment in humanity, that this chap couldn't just have a conversation. And at the end of the day, I think the kind of absurdity of all of it was we were actually sitting in a coffee shop on the coffee shop seats drinking a coffee, and essentially what we got fined for was that because the coffee wasn't in our mouths at that time, our mask should be on our face and we should be taking our mask down to sip the coffee. Now I totally understand, like if the rule is you've got to have masks on when you're not eating or drinking, technically it means when that drink is not or food is not at your mouth, it should be in your face. I think obviously you read rules and you think okay, there's a level of common sense or there must be some leeway within these rules, which to be honest, I mean, good lesson. It's reminded me now, okay, I need to step up my game and being even more diligent with it. But I, like you said, I understand where the guy's coming from. You don't know his story. Perhaps he's got he's lost family members or friends that have suffered from COVID, and therefore he feels very strongly about people wearing masks. So yeah, I think very quickly I've moved on from it. And actually, we talked about kind of disputing it. And I think there is a strong case to dispute this. But I also do know that the process will go most likely to court
for about 5 years.
There's going to be lots of processes that's going to be, have to go through this. And I think for me, I would just rather move on through it. 5,000 is actually still quite a lot of money. But anyway, good story for the grandchildren.
It was a good story. But apart from that, my day's been really good.
Yeah, me too. I went when the heat cooled off and that the sun is shining. It's an absolute beauty of a day.
Beautiful day.
It feels like it's like autumn time. Like it's like 24 degrees.
Humidity's dropped. Last week, the humidity in Hong Kong was unbearable. It went up to like 95%. Yeah. It wasn't very nice. It was very sticky. Yeah, we had a bit of a rainy weekend, and I think that cleared things up a little bit. Anyway, we're here recording a podcast, and we're here to talk about the concept of finding a way to balance resistance training and conditioning. Question we get asked a lot: how much resistance training should I be doing, or weight training in most people's eyes? How much resistance training should I be doing? How much conditioning do I need? Is it 50-50? Do I need to do more of one or the other? And so we're just going to dig into that question and dive down many different rabbit holes, and hopefully by the end of this episode give you some food for thought to be able to make your own choice on what the appropriate dosage of each is for you. So I think the first question the first thing we need to clear up is we need to define what resistance training and conditioning is. So Liam, how would you go ahead and define resistance training? Well, I think resistance training is moving external load, right? It's getting big, it's getting jacked, we're tearing down muscle tissue, we are doing lots of things with resistance training. Could be sport specific. I think there's very many different ways to talk about resistance training, but I think just thinking about it as we're externally pushing load, right?
Yeah. Or I guess just applying resistance to the body. So that could be external load, but I think body weights, gymnastics, calisthenics. So essentially why people would do resistance training, most people are doing it to probably alter body composition in some way, shape or form. So they're trying to build muscle. Perhaps they have specific goals of trying to increase endurance, hypertrophy, strength, absolute strength. Perhaps they're performing or competing or partaking in a sport which requires certain levels of strength, and that's where they're training for it. Some people actually might be doing resistance training for general health. They understand the benefits of resistance training on things like bone density, bulletproofing your body against injury. Why else might someone do resistance training? I guess very specific goals to their sport, like their sport might require.
Yeah, I was thinking more on like a sport specific, something like specific as in like your sport, like powerlifting, for example, weightlifting.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So I think that gives us a bit of a vague definition on what we're talking about when we talk about resistance training in this podcast. The next thing is let's talk about conditioning training. What do we typically mean by conditioning training?
I think of like we're either talking about like sustainable training or non-sustainable. We're talking about the body making energy and essentially expressing energy through the form of some sort of conditioning.
So I think we look at probably two spectrums, and now we've got sustainable, or what most of us would refer to as aerobic training. So we're thinking about longer bouts of work at lower intensities, and I guess on the other end of the spectrum, non-sustainable or quote unquote anaerobic style of training, where we're doing short pieces at very high intensities which you can't sustain for very long times. I think the majority of the population who are doing conditioning work are probably going to be more towards the sustainable aerobic side of training, whether they know it or not. That's the form of aerobic training most of us do. And of course, you've got to take in the fact, like, walking is aerobic training, commuting back and forth from work.
It's what we're actually meant to do as humans, right?
Yeah, exactly. Basic primal function is we're essentially using oxygen, which is what we're talking about with aerobic training, for pretty much every activity that we do all the time. So why would someone do aerobic conditioning or conditioning training?
Well, very similar to resistance training. It can be maybe to alter body composition. It can be, well, I think going even a step further, like what's those intentions? Like we want those lungs, we want the muscles, and we want everything working in unison, right? We want that breathing up, we want to move blood. It can be for recovery purposes. If maybe it's someone specific to the sport of resistance, maybe powerlifting, maybe on one day they're going for a walk just to move blood to help that recovery or move length, as we say.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it could be very sport specific. So let's say someone's training for a marathon or an endurance type event, then of course they need to be doing conditioning training to support their goal in trying to be at their best for whenever the competition rolls around. Like you said, as a general health marker.
Yeah, just live long, right?
Yeah, when we know that the aerobic system is at play all day, every day, investing some time in developing capacity within the aerobic system is going to probably benefit you in everyday life. Even strength athletes, there is a role that the aerobic system plays, which is essentially the recovery between bouts of resistance training. So between sets, between reps, the aerobic systems at play, and a more well-developed aerobic system between sessions is going to allow the athlete to recover faster to be able to do another effective bout of resistance training. Cool. Pretty good definitions of each.
I think so.
Let's talk about this concept of rate of adaptation. So I guess what we're talking about here is how long does it take to make progress within resistance training? How long does it take to make progress within conditioning training? Now, of course, like that concept alone, I guess both of them are somewhat infinite to a degree. So I guess we're not talking about reaching full human potential, but generally speaking, we know that the rate of adaptation to aerobic training for most folks is going to be faster, which what we mean by that, we can develop higher levels of aerobic capacity in a shorter amount of time versus developing strength in most folks is going to take longer time. It's going to take a little bit more consistency and repetition and volume in the long run before we start to see improvements. Now, obviously, a caveat to that is that some people genetically may be predisposed to be more aerobic. You can have some people genetically who are more predisposed to be strong and powerful. There are stories of 16-year-old kids walking into the gym in the first time and squatting over 100 kg arse to grass, no problem at all.
Power cleaning 100 kg, I've seen it before. It's crazy.
Never lifted a weight, just natural levels of strength. To that person might see bigger, faster progressions within strength training, relatively speaking, and may always struggle to create progression in the aerobic system, just because their body is essentially fighting against the opposite. We have to understand that resistance training and the aerobic system are generally kind of two counter ends of the spectrum. If we're going to really try to drive and improve our ability to do resistance training, and we see that expressed in terms of 1RMs or 5RMs or the amount of muscle mass in the body, it means that we can't be doing a whole amount of aerobic training if we want to really maximize that, because essentially aerobic training to an extent will take away from the ability to create resistance training adaptations, or the adaptations that come from resistance training. And conversely, someone who is trying to develop the aerobic system as effectively as possible, if they're doing high levels of resistance training on the side, will blunt their adaptations to the aerobic system.
Well, it'll just take longer, right? And if that is the goal, that conversation needs to take place, right?
Yeah, not to say it's impossible. No, it would just take longer. Okay, so I think generally speaking, is that resistance training, making long-term progress, it just takes longer. Whereas within conditioning training, for most of us, we can develop faster rates of adaptation in shorter amounts of time.
Can I ask you, why do you think that is?
I just think that the aerobic system, as we said, is at play all the time.
It's had longer to develop.
Yeah,
because we've had it for so long, right?
And I think essentially from the day we're living, breathing organisms and we come out of the womb, the aerobic system is to an extent being developed. And through play, through movement, through everyday life. Whereas for most folks, outside of maybe primary school, kindergarten play, they get to secondary school, a lot of people essentially stop resistance training activities. So they stop playing sport, they stop climbing trees, they stop going to playgrounds and
monkey bars.
They stop competitive sport or even recreational sport. And so essentially, the resistance training that we're doing is just the resistance that we're applying to our everyday life activities, like picking up the pots and pans to cook, carrying our laptop, lifting our bag. All those forms essentially are forms of resistance. And technically walking is applying resistance to your body to move from A to B. So there is some resistance taking place, but I think just generally speaking, the amount of demand placed on the body with the aerobic system is just always at play. We couldn't actually probably survive without any form of aerobic capacity present in the body. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, that was what I was thinking in my head. I think it's just like you said, we've actually been, we live and breathe and we walk most of our life, right? Even since we're, like you said, since we're kids, we're crawling about, playing about. Those lungs and muscles are developing and working at the same time. We don't really get that, like you said, after maybe 12, 15, like when you're 16 years old, you kind of stop playing around in the monkey bars and climbing the trees. So I think that's where it kind of blunts that adaptation to the resistance training. Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I've never actually put a thought into why it's just something within strength and conditioning literature that you just learn early. We need to talk about how we can provide a framework for folks to dictate or decide what an appropriate amount of resistance training would be versus what an appropriate amount of conditioning training would be. And just some food for thought here. So let's talk about a general health client. So this individual, maybe let's take out the word client, just someone whose goals are just general health, which means they're trying to optimize health, live long and prosper. So when we talk about general health, things we're probably thinking about are, they want to be able to show up and do the daily things they have to do in their daily life with a high degree of efficiency and ability. They want to have an aerobic system to allow them to do aerobic activities, which is more or less everything we do. They want to have levels of strength to allow them to, again, partake in the things they need to do on a daily basis, but also probably bulletproof themselves against potential for injury and harm, and be able to essentially express themselves as humans. Body composition probably isn't going to be a primary goal for someone whose goal is general health, but we also do understand that a certain level of leanness is optimal. We know that toxins store themselves in fat cells, so it should be within our interest to not be having a large amount of fat stores on our body. Obviously, they're probably thinking about things like health metrics, like blood markers. They want to be going to doctors and getting a health checkup every year, getting their bloods done and know that they're within healthy levels. What else might a general health client?
Yeah, I think just their day-to-day function, right? Can they, like, what is their function? Is their function a mother? Well, they're probably going to have to pick up the kids a few times during the day, get them in and out of the car. Is their function a teacher, right? Well, they're probably going to be on their feet quite long periods of the day, so they're probably going to want to have an aerobic system developed and have a strong core to be able to stand on their feet all day. So again, just going back to like what's the function of the individual, but I think just in a broad spectrum, like Ed said, it's like function and just living optimally and living for a long time, right?
Yeah. So I think for generally speaking, a safe bet, safe starting place is we probably looked for like a 50-50.
Yeah.
A 50-50 blend of spending some time doing resistance training, spending some time doing some aerobic training. So if that's 3 sessions a week, it means, essentially 50-50 means 1.5 sessions you're doing resistance training, 1.5 sessions you're doing conditioning training. That doesn't really work like that all the time. This is where things like blended training come into the picture, where maybe every session that we're doing is a combination of both resistance training and conditioning work. Yeah. But I think a big question we have to ask here is when we assess the individual is, well, what are we doing? If we're talking about the actual specific training sessions right now, what's happening outside those training sessions? So we know that when we look at the daily life of our population, we have some people who are maybe a little bit more sedentary. They drive to work, they sit at their desk, they eat work at their desk, they drive home, and that's pretty much the majority of the movement in a day. We have other people, maybe like myself, yourself, who walk or ride their bike in their commute to work. So it means they're doing a lot more aerobic activities always throughout the day. That's something we've got to factor in as well. Because we're not just looking at, the general health client, like they may actually be doing a lot of aerobic activities already. And the likelihood of them doing more aerobic activities outside the training room is probably a little bit higher than doing resistance training outside.
Even in a place, in a place like Hong Kong, where like people are going on hikes every weekend, they are walking their dogs, and I think that's an important point to make. And you have to have that conversation with your clients. So you actually are doing aerobic work when you're doing your 90-minute hike every week on a Sunday, and you're walking the dog 3 times a week. That's might be adequate aerobic training for yourself, which means
for your function.
Yeah. So that means we'll maybe focus a bit more on resistance training for the next 6 weeks. The weather gets too hot, you maybe dial down on your hikes, right? Well, let's bring down the resistance training, bump up that aerobic training, and that's the beauty of working with a coach and client, right? That's a relationship where you can move things around depending on seasons, right?
Yeah, very good point. But I think the general principle here is like look to have a blend of both resistance training and conditioning training within your training regimen. Now, of course, like Liam said, that could be an even 50-50 that you continue throughout the year. So all year, your training cycle is every session. You start the session with some resistance training or conditioning, and you finish with the opposite. You could be working through blocks throughout the year. So maybe you do 6 weeks where we have a little bit more of a bias, maybe a 60-40 bias towards resistance training, a little bit less conditioning. And then the next training cycle, we bias it the other way. We do 60-40 with a bias towards conditioning, 40% resistance. And essentially we can flip-flop throughout the year, and we'd still, over a 12-month period,
still accumulating
a pretty even blend of that. Of course, what you could also do is you could do a kind of like a rolling 2-week schedule. So a 2-week plan. So day 1, if you're training 3 days a week in this case, day 1 you're doing resistance training, day 2 you're doing conditioning, day 3 you're doing resistance training, day 4 you're doing conditioning, and basically just alternate over and over and over again. So that wouldn't work really within a 7-day window, so you kind of have to carry that over to the second week. Nice. Let's talk about the individual whose goals are specifically body composition. So let's be a bit more specific here. Let's say this individual is trying to build as much lean muscle mass as possible. So they're trying to build lean muscle mass and trying to have a reduction in body fat mass. So for this individual, functionality isn't that important.
That's not the main goal.
That's not the main goal. How this person would define success would be essentially like, what is my overall level of lean body mass and probably percentage body fat. Those are things they're concerned with. Maybe that's a little bit more aesthetic based, but we're not judging here. This is just the goals of the client. So if we have a body composition client, of course, obviously a very important thing we have to think about is our starting prescription. Where are we starting at with this client? Is this client very overweight? In which case they're a long way away from their goals. Let's say they have a goal of 10% body fat, and currently they're sat at 30% body fat. That's going to be a very different training prescription to the individual who's already 12% body fat and wants to increase 2 kilograms of lean muscle mass, maintaining a 10 to 12% body fat. The prescription is going to be very, very different. So we have to kind of appreciate and respect that. But let's take that first individual. So we have someone who's currently got levels of body fat mass that are higher than they want. They've set a goal of losing, let's say they're currently at 30% body fat and they want to get to 10% body fat. What kind of distribution of resistance training and aerobic training might we generally look at? And I think we have to, guys, we have to keep
a very
that
general
has to, because there's so many nuances. We've got to factor in things like stress markers. We've got to do, like, we can do functional medicine diagnostics and actually see what this person can tolerate. But we'll kind of just go off general assumptions here.
How long is this individual? How many sessions are we doing per week?
Let's go off a general avatar of 3 sessions a week.
So that would be like the blended training that we've done with the previous client that we talked about. So we are blending throughout the week. We're blending resistance training, and we're just giving small doses of aerobic training throughout, or conditioning work throughout their week. Now that might look like we talked about with the previous client, it might look like on day 1 you're starting with resistance, finishing with some sort of conditioning work. Day 2, it might be starting with some conditioning work, finishing with resistance. Might be on day 3, then you're just flip-flopping, so you're going back to resistance and finishing with conditioning work. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think obviously, a caveat we need to clear up is like what the conditioning training is looking like. I think for the argument of this conversation, we're talking about sustainable and repeatable work. So let's say if we're programming 10 minutes of aerobic training, in this case, what we're saying is that we're executing the 10-minute aerobic piece at a pace that they can sustain for 30 to 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Right, let's just create that argument. So it means that they're not finishing their aerobic training on their backs, gasping for air. They're finishing, still walking.
Seeing stars.
Yeah, don't want that. Heart rate comes back down to resting in the next kind of like 4 to 5 minutes and they continue with their day. That's what we're talking about. I think with that individual, I think, a form of blended training is probably quite appropriate. I want to ask you now, thinking back to when you first started coaching people and you had this client whose goal was to improve their body composition. What was your general prescription? Did you lean towards more resistance training or did you lean more towards aerobic conditioning?
I think I've always leaned towards resistance training. Why? Because I think that's what I was the most comfortable prescribing as a coach. I think it's only in the past couple of years where I've really dug into conditioning work and understood progressions and how to prescribe effectively. But I love bodybuilding, right? I love lifting weights, and I've always erred towards more resistance training. Yourself?
It was funny. The other day, I have these like stone coasters which I put my drinks on our dining table, and you won't be able to see me, those listening, but I was stepping my feet up and my fingers up and down onto the stone coaster. I don't know why. I was just lost in thought doing it, and it reminded me of the first year I started personal training. So it's about almost 15 years ago now. And the majority of training that I was doing at the time was resistance training. Yeah. It was structured, S&C, periodized, programmed, upper body, lower body splits. And so I knew that was what I should be prescribing. I didn't know much, but I had an inkling that's what I should be prescribing to my clients. But I was always apprehensive at just prescribing that because I would see how little my clients would be working. Well, and what I'd mean by the way that I would judge how hard they're working was based on how much they were breathing and how much they were sweating. And because their goal was lose body fat, I was thinking, shit, I'm not working them hard enough here. Like, they're going to think that they're not doing enough work. I was very much in the mindset that like they need to be breathing hard and like panting hard, sweating lots in order to actually, number one, gain my trust as a coach, and number 2, going to arrive at their goals. And the reason that stepping up onto the stone coaster was making me think about it is I would prescribe often. I just remember one lady vividly that I used to coach. I think her name was Julia. We would do A1 would be like a dumbbell bench press. A2 would be a cable row. A3 would be step up on this thing for 60 seconds as fast as you can, just to get, with the pure intention of getting your heart rate up. Not necessarily a terrible prescription, but it didn't really serve any purpose other than trying to fatigue and tire this individual out. So when I think back to, when I first started getting into coaching, I definitely knew the importance of resistance training and why that was a much better option long term. But I was getting roped into the quick fix.
Well, you kind of feel that pressure as well. I mean, I think just reflecting back on your reflection, I'm thinking about actually, well, when I first started coaching, you kind of do fall into that pressure of, well, you look what everyone else is doing. They're all doing hard metcons.
Everyone's doing HIIT.
Everyone doing HIIT, Les Mills, and you're thinking, well, why am I not doing that? And then it's, well, you're not confident as a coach to sit down and explain to your client why you're doing what you're doing. And then it's like you're thinking, and then you end up actually just giving them a hit session at the end just because you feel pressurized, right?
Yeah. And the intention when you say it is like, well, we need to burn calories. And, I want to arrive at your destination faster. Now, of course, there's so many things that went into that probably happening, like probably poor goal setting, poor consultation process. We didn't really understand what the client's goals were. I know a lot of it was lack of knowledge and understanding from myself, like you said. So I didn't have the ability to explain the intention. So, you just kind of get wrapped up into what everyone else is doing. And, when I think back to 10, 15 years ago, you're right. Like everyone was doing HIIT. HIIT was the thing. It was a popular thing that everyone wanted to do. And then, you get into CrossFit and suddenly like HIIT has just taken a whole new meaning.
Whole new level.
And now it's like, it's not only just breathing hard. It's like you need to finish your session on your back, ruined. I've left the PT studio and you're still there recovering. Like that is a sign of
barbells flying around, fucking jumping on rigs. Yeah.
So I think I can understand why coaches lean towards this, and I can also understand that probably why a lot of coaches lean towards this is the pressure from clients and what they understand to be effective training. But I guess, where we're at now is understanding that resistance training, you are going to arrive at your destination perhaps a little bit longer, because the actual caloric burn per session is going to be less, but we're doing a lot of really great things in the process as well. We're building strong foundations, we're building a healthy body. We know as well, the more muscle mass we can build an individual, the more calories we're burning at rest essentially. But, we've learned from our mistakes. Okay, let's talk about the next client. So let's say we have an individual who has sport-specific goals. So obviously this is very nuanced now. So I've got 4 avatars here. And remember, what we're trying to answer here is like, what would be some food for thought in terms of a prescription for how much resistance training versus conditioning. Let's say we have an individual who wants to do a marathon.
Okay.
What do you think?
Oh, you just giving me that? That was it? I thought you were going to give me a bit more than that.
This client's never done a marathon before.
Never done a marathon.
They've got a marathon in 6 months' time. Now, here's a kicker, though. This individual has never done resistance training. Run their first marathon, and they've never done resistance training. They're coming to you as a coach, and they're saying, right, coach, what do I do?
And I've got free reign here.
6 months.
6 months. I think that there's obviously a big place for resistance training in this client's journey. If the person has never done resistance training and they've never done a marathon either, and we understand that we need muscle on the body to protect. Example, knees. If the client's going to be running a 4-hour marathon, those knees are going to take a beating. So as a strength coach, I'm thinking, well, I need to get that body as strong as possible to be able to express that run.
Yes.
In terms of the aerobic, well, I am going to have to bias aerobic training. I've never trained someone that wants to run a marathon, but there obviously has to be a bias towards aerobic training. But there is a place for resistance training. And I think just going off that conversation, it is a bit of a rabbit hole, but I do feel that a lot of runners out there, or maybe endurance athletes, quote unquote, they kind of miss that step with resistance training. And they kind of don't realize the value that has. Now, we talked about, if you want to run, like you think of that impact on your knees, on your hips, on basically every joint in your body. If you're running 4 hours, that is a lot of impact. So you need to be strong, right? Hamstrings, quads, core, upper body. You need to be physically strong to be able to express a run, right?
Yeah, when I think about the endurance athlete and the runner specifically, in this case, with 6 months, you don't have a whole amount of time, to be honest. And of course, like questions we have to ask is like, what's the starting point? If this is already an aerobic individual who's maybe not far off being able to run a marathon already from the start, well, then that changes the game a little bit. That means maybe we've got a little bit more time available to invest into resistance training, and then perhaps we do a bit of a push and bias towards conditioning work a little bit later, a little bit closer to the race. If someone's miles away from even completing a marathon, even at walking pace, well then it's going to be harder to find time or to prioritize the importance of resistance training in that schedule. But I think, resistance training for the endurance athlete serves two really important roles. Like you said, number one is the specificity of improving strength on the tissues, joints and muscles and movements used in the sport. So in this case, in a marathon runner, it's, cultivating strength in the ankles, the quads, the hamstrings, the calves, the trunk, the ability to maintain posture throughout long periods of time. There's probably going to be main things at play. The upper body still has a part to play as well.
100%.
Your arms aren't just hanging by your sides when you're doing a marathon. We've got a swinging motion, shoulder extension, and essentially a degree of shoulder flexion as well. And the pecs and lats and the traps have big roles to play there as well. So that's number one. It's strength conditioning or resistance training to actually improve the function of the tissues, joints and movements of the actual sport. And then the second part to it is strength conditioning or resistance training to offset the repetitive strain that occurs from the sport. So if we think about the athlete who's running marathons, we know that pretty much the same muscles are at play every time they go out running. There may be some degrees when they change directions, but there's not a whole much of direction change that's happening in marathon. We're pretty much running in a straight line. We pretty much have the same gait for the entire time for up to 3 to 5 hours. So resistance training plays an important role in making sure that if we just allow that individual to just do those same movements forever and ever and ever, we're going to create some biases or compensations in the way that some imbalances essentially in our muscle growth. And for most people who run and do a lot of running isn't their only goal in life. Professional runner, it's a different conversation because their sole purpose in life might just be to run, in which case you may just have to accept, the runner's body is going to look a bit different and function a little bit different to the everyday individual who isn't running all the time. But for most people who are running recreationally to support life, then it should be within our interest from a longevity standpoint to not be beaten up after the race and be able to easily transition back into life without any pains, issues or long-standing injuries. So resistance training in this way means that we need to be training all the tissues, all the joints and all the movements that aren't involved in running to make sure that when we go through a bout of running prep and actually do the marathon, we've got some opposing muscle tissues that are strong enough to help keep us a little bit more balanced.
Yeah, the first thing that comes to my mind when you're having those thoughts is, well, it's a structural balance then when you're taking on an individual like a runner, right? We're maybe not testing heavy back squats and 2-rep maxes and power cleans and snatches. It maybe is just you're really working on unilateral stuff, right? You're working on that structural balance just in order to keep them safe and sound when they do want to go run, right? Yeah,
exactly. So going back to our avatar now, you've got the 6-month period. I think at the start of that 6 months, you're going to be doing a little bit more bias towards actually kind of maybe it's a blend of both. You're trying to think about offsetting some of the repetitive strain that's about to happen when we start doing lots more running, but we're also thinking about priming the tissues, joints and movements that are going to be involved in running. Yes. And then as we get closer to race day and the individual starts to do more running, because they're going to have to do more running, that's where our resistance training starts to become more about offsetting the repetitive strain of the running. So it means that we're doing more work on the tissues, joints and muscles that aren't involved in running in our resistance training sessions, and therefore that would allow you to actually continue to resistance train almost all the way up into the race, because the resistance training wouldn't necessarily be taking away from their ability to run.
And I think that's that fine balance, right? It's like, well, if the individual does have the goal, let the goal be the goal. They're going to have to run, but don't be testing 3-rep maxes going into the week of a marathon, right? So it's just about having that bigger picture, and that just goes back to the importance of periodizing and planning your prescription out, right? We need to know 6 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 weeks what that individual is going to be doing, because they are training a bit more specific for a certain goal, right?
Nice. Let's move on to our next client. Let's talk about someone who's doing OCR. Do you know what OCR stands for?
Obstacle course race?
Yes.
Obstacle
course racing. Racing. So basically this is like a Spartan race or a Tough Mudder, where essentially primarily it's an endurance-based event, but there are parts of the race where they have to
that stuff's
use
hard.
Resistance. It's really hard. So it might be a blend of calisthenics, so basically maneuvering their body weight, climbing ropes, doing monkey bars, doing burpees, or actually moving external load like picking up atlas stones, carrying buckets,
farmers carries,
all that kind of stuff.
They do like the monkey bars as well across, right? With the rings sometimes as well. I've seen that. It's pretty hard.
Have you done one?
No, I've never done it. But in Dubai, there's a massive crowd in Dubai that do OCR. It's huge
This
over
must
there.
be so. Surely you can't do it in Dubai though.
No, they've managed to do
Certain
it.
times of the year. I
Yeah,
guess.
certain. Obviously not in the summer, but like winter, they have like proper seasons, and actually a lot of the guys go round and use the CrossFit gyms. They've got like teams out there. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, Tammy had a client that she went to Germany with. She was competing in
That was the High Rocks, no?
High Rocks.
High
that's
Rocks.
it. Yeah,
That's becoming huge now.
It's
It's
all
massive.
becoming
It's
massive.
Puma, the sponsor, I
Yeah,
think.
is
It's
that
pretty cool.
I did a Spartan race.
In Hong Kong.
I did the sprint, the first ever Spartan race. I think it was a 5K Spartan race.
How long did that take you? Did you finish it?
I finished it.
Yeah.
I think I finished. Ant finished in the top 10,
Nice.
and I think
Classic.
I finished in the top 20.
Nice.
I think I was about 15. It was actually really, really fun. I was ruined,
Yeah.
obviously. I was ruined for at least a week. And I think the thing that I massively underappreciated was how much of an endurance event it was.
Yes.
I thought I'd just be able to stroll in.
Just
I'm like,
rock
I
up.
can
Yeah.
rope climb, I can do monkey bars, I can scale a wall, and I can run. But it's like, you look at the top 10 men and women, like they're all triathletes.
Yeah.
And like it was 3, 2, 1. Those guys just took off. And in my head, I'm thinking I'll catch them in the obstacles. But like the obstacles weren't challenging enough
To really slow them
to
down.
slow them
Yeah.
down enough. And it was just like the time spent in the running between it was such a huge separator. It was really eye-opening though, really fun to do. But I think after that, I now appreciate, obviously each of these individual disciplines. High Rocks is different to Tough Mudder, which is different to
Spartan.
I know, yeah, High Rocks has a lot of like ski ergs and rowing and stuff like that. But generally speaking, these are endurance events, which means that for this individual, like you need to, resistance training plays a part. It's really important. But the majority of the time is going to be spent focusing on the aerobic system. The thing is as well, I guess it's a trade-off you're always looking at. If you can be elite in your aerobic abilities, that just puts you so far ahead in between the obstacles, potentially you lose out a little bit on the obstacles.
Then
That might be a good trade-off and worthwhile to someone. It's the same conversation in CrossFit, which we talk about all the time. It's like, for the individual who is a weaker individual. I'll take myself, for example.
Yeah.
I'm happy to share this. But I would class myself within, generally speaking, my level of competition. I'm a weaker athlete, and I probably excel better or excel more on a leaderboard when it's more of an aerobic type test. So the question for me would be, it's obviously just work on developing your strength a little bit more. But when I look at where my strength numbers are at, based off statistical data, things like 1RMs and Olympic lifts and absolute strengths like back squat, deadlift, presses, even if I was to bring up those absolute strength and speed strength numbers by 10%, how does that change on the leaderboard? Doesn't really actually. Like I'm that far behind the level of competition that even a 10% increase probably wouldn't manipulate my placing on leaderboard that much. However, a 10% increase further in my skills and my aerobic capacity would make even greater of a leap on a leaderboard. So for me, the trade-off, it's not just as simple as like this or that. You're trading this for that. It's actually like, where are you relative to your field of competition on both of those things?
And do you think by increasing your absolute strength, say by that 10%, would that take away from you aerobically, just for the time and energy that you'd have to spend developing that strength? Do you think that your aerobic system would take a hit?
I think for me, what I've realized, because essentially that is what I've done. The last few years, I have created more of a bias towards strength training than lead up. But I find that I can step away from aerobic type activities or specific aerobic training and come back after a few months and still be able to have decently high levels of aerobic capacity. And I think a lot of that comes back to
your sporting
background, having done majority aerobic type activities pretty much all my life, and being a fairly slow twitch individual who's always leaned more towards like slow and sustainable versus fast and explosive. Conversely, I probably look at you and someone like Al, especially because he's been lifting weights for a really long time. Al can step away from snatching for 9 weeks and still come in and hit 90% of his 1RM easy. He still can maintain 90% of his back squat, having not back squatted for months. I feel like if I step away from a back squat for 4 weeks, I lose touch with the movement and the expression needed so fast that I kind of need another 4 weeks to get me back up there. Whereas, he feels the opposite with aerobic training. You probably step away from aerobic training for a long period of time and you feel completely out of touch and have to build it back up again.
Interesting.
Okay, so then let's talk about field sports. Let's talk about rugby football athletes. I guess the question is where does resistance training come into these guys?
I think the question goes what time of the year we're in, about off season, pre-season, in season, what's happening. But I think obviously let's take someone that plays football, for example. We know the majority of their time they're going to be running around the field. Now, us as a coach, as strength and conditioning coaches, I'm probably going to say I'm going to bias more towards resistance training because we want to keep them similar to our endurance athletes. We want to keep them as structurally sound as possible because remember, what's their goal? They want to be running around the field, maybe scoring goals, whatever their position is. We've got to make sure that they're structurally balanced to be able to express their goal, right?
Yeah, I work with quite a few field athletes and have done in the past, specifically rugby. And essentially, you have a very finite period of every single year where you want to bias resistance training to get the individual to be as strong, as healthy, and as structurally balanced as possible. And essentially, once pre-season starts and they start stepping onto the field 3-4 times a week, resistance training gets put as kind of a secondary afterthought. Basically, once the season starts, you're just trying to maintain and hang on to the goals, the gains that you created in the off season as much as possible. And then the Christmas window rolls around. You normally got 2 to 3 weeks. You try to bump it up a little bit there, and then the season starts again for the second half of the season, and you're just trying to maintain with the expectation that they're going to lose strength, they're probably going to lose power, and they're gonna become a little bit less structurally balanced. And then the next season starts again and you just rebuild and you rebuild. And what you're hoping for is that every new season, when you start that rebuild, you're starting just a little bit stronger and more resilient than the last year. So over a 5-10 year period, that athlete is making improvements in both resistance training and conditioning, but it's just slow. And also you got to factor in things like injuries. Injuries and setbacks will really displace long-term progression in an individual. And I think about that with me a lot of the time. I had a good 5 to 6 years where I had a major operation on some joint in my body almost consecutively. And when I think back, it's I lost 5 to 6 years between the ages of 18 to 23, 24, where I didn't get to make any progression on any real joint in my body because it was upper body, lower body, upper body, lower body. And it was just when that all finished was when I could basically start proper strength and conditioning at the age of kind of 24.
Nice.
Interesting. Cool. And then we got something like powerlifting. Let's talk about powerlifters and limit lifters. So obviously the goal their sport requires them to express maximal levels of absolute strength or strength speed. What role does conditioning training play for these athletes?
I think when I think of a power athlete, Olympic lifting, I think of aerobic training playing a part of longevity, but also think of the part of, we talked about, recovery. You might only be doing 3 lifts, but it's your ability to recover from that first lift to be able to maximally express that second lift. So I think aerobic training does have a part to play. But again, like I said before, let the goal be the goal. If the goal is to become as strong as possible, well, you're probably going to have to bias that. But have the conversation with your client, and let them understand the role that aerobic training does have to play, right? And like you said, with the runner, they're probably not going to be powerlifting their whole life. Maybe it's just for the next 6 years. But we remember, when we're taking on clients, we're not just thinking 6 years, we're maybe thinking 16 years. So I think that conversation needs to happen. Well, you're doing resistance training, that's a goal. We're going to bias that, but we still want to drip feed aerobic training in there so that when you do finish your resistance training or your powerlifting, you're still healthy, joints are still good, etc. Yeah,
I kind of think it's the opposite to what we've been talking about. The marathon runner who in their, or the endurance field athlete who in their off season needs to bias resistance training. You look at the powerlifter or the Olympic lifter, their off seasons might actually be the opposite. They may need to be exposing themselves to a little bit more conditioning training, not enough to completely take away from the strength training and the hypertrophy, because a lot of off seasons for power athletes might be a little bit more things like strength endurance and hypertrophy training, where they're working the other end of the strength continuum to essentially build foundations to allow them to express maximal level strength later on. But this is where the off season, conditioning training can actually play a part, and maybe that features a little bit more in their off season. Essentially, when the season starts, they've got to be putting their credits and time and resources into just doing the thing, which is in this case powerlifting, resistance training. Let me ask you, in your training right now, and we're pretty much doing very similar things. What's your bias of resistance training versus conditioning work at the moment?
I think it's pretty even split right now. I'm doing an extra endurance session on a Thursday. Doing that on the bike erg.
You told me about that.
I did. I told you last week.
I cycle into work
just for some recovery work on a Thursday, some active recovery. But I think it's pretty balanced throughout the week. We are getting touches of resistance training. We've got one full day which is just dedicated to aerobic training. That's a Tuesday. But throughout the week we are getting touches for resistance training and aerobic training. I would say now in the off season we are getting a bit more touches of resistance training just to build good foundations. Yeah,
I would say that I'm definitely doing a bit more of a bias towards resistance training at the moment, because I'm not doing Saturday tests at the moment. I've been giving myself 2 full rest days on weekends. So basically Monday, Wednesday, Friday, a little bit more resistance training biased. I'd probably say like an 80-20% bias. And I have 1 full day of actually dedicated aerobic training where we're doing things on ergs and running and stuff. But then I also do cycle into work or back from work 2 to 3 times a week. I do accumulate at least 10 to 12,000 steps every single day. So I am getting some like low volume, we call it zone 1, zone 2 aerobic
zone
training.
2, baby.
Yeah, aerobic training in all the time. Cool. Do you want to talk about the CrossFitter?
I think we should.
Let's talk about the CrossFitter.
Yeah.
Okay. Does the CrossFitter need to be doing more resistance training or more conditioning? Well, let's firstly define the sport. And obviously that's a tough one in itself, because depending upon what level of the sport you are competing in or you want to compete in, will dictate the variety of the tests. So if you're someone who wants to compete at the CrossFit Games, well, you need to be good at absolutely everything. If you're someone who wants to partake in the Open, based on this year's CrossFit Open, being able to express maximal strength is not important. You need to be more aerobically conditioned and be able to move moderate to mod heavy loads for moderate to high volumes. If you're someone who wants to take part in the quarterfinals, well, then you're going to have to express a 1RM of some form based on the last 2 years of experience and data collection. So in which case it should be within your interest to be doing a balance of resistance training and aerobic training. But for the most part, when you look at the majority of tests that are tested at any level, the aerobic system is challenged and tested much more than resistance training or resistance type training activities. So therefore, for most folks, I would class CrossFit as an aerobic sport.
Yeah, but that's my bit. I was going to say that CrossFit is an enduring sport.
Endurance sport,
and you look at the quarterfinals, like that's 4 events. No, sorry, 5 events? 6 events?
5 events.
5 events over, 3 days? Yeah. That's an endurance sport. You're not just doing one and then taking 3 weeks off. Like that total volume throughout that weekend, you're going to have to be aerobic to be able to recover from those bouts of effort from the AM to the PM. That takes your body, that takes a lot of resources. And we know those resources, majority are going to come from the aerobic system, your ability to recover, to be able to come back and express that again in the PM session, right?
Yeah. I think, and it's very right, I think another thing we need to define here as well, competitive versus recreational. Are you using CrossFit as a means of just training for general health? Or are you using CrossFit as a means of training because you want to compete in the sport to some level? Maybe it's just a weekend competition locally. Maybe it's a CrossFit Open. Maybe it's quarterfinals. Maybe it's the CrossFit Games. But having definition there, because I think if you're someone who just enjoys CrossFit style training, you like learning the skills of the sport. So that's things like kipping pull-ups, maybe muscle ups, learning how to snatch, do Olympic lifts. Well, then, if they're not necessarily... you don't have the intention of testing yourself at any certain time of the year, then maybe just a nice even blend of resistance training and aerobic capacity, which is generally like how most affiliates will program. The session starts with strength training and it finishes with some form of metabolic conditioning. Then maybe that's a pretty good general prescription for general health. We're not going to dive into the nuances of what is being programmed, but I think generally speaking that works. But I think if you have most individuals who have, let's say, more competitive goals or like to test themselves at some point within the calendar, they have self-perceived or data-supported strengths and weaknesses. And for most people, we tend to lean towards maybe more strength being a weakness, or we tend to lean towards maybe
Aerobic.
more. Now, obviously, there are way more facets that come into the sport of CrossFit,
Skills.
like skill development, exactly, pacing awareness. But for now, let's just talk about these two. So I think if you're someone who is generally a more, let's take myself and yourself as our two avatars, myself being a more enduring individual who's a little bit less strong, more powerful. Generally speaking, throughout the year, I'm probably going to bias more strength style activities.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically, I don't know what that looks like, but I'd say generally speaking, we divide our year up into different stages.
Yep.
So at the moment, I probably have more of like a 70 to 30 resistance training bias towards conditioning work. As I get closer towards the CrossFit Open and quarterfinals, that turns into more like a 60-40 conditioning work against resistance training, because I know that's what the sport's going to be testing me on. You?
Yeah, I would say I have to bias the opposite. So I would say naturally I'm a bit more powerful and stronger. I definitely need to be biasing more aerobic style work.
Yes.
So yeah, that I would probably have to. Well, I know now we're generally training about the same, but I do know that at some point if I do want to be competitive, I am going to have to really focus on my aerobic system.
But the thing, going back to what we talked about at the start of this episode, is that we both know that developing the aerobic system happens a lot faster than resistance training. So in the sport of CrossFit, for most people in the off season, we probably should be biasing more towards resistance style activities or lower intensity, easier aerobic style training. Because we know that the sport stuff, which is basically what the tests look like, it's hard shit. It's hard training. And we can't do that stuff all year round. So essentially we save that for like a peaking period, which might be anywhere between 1 to 3 to 4 months, depending on who the individual is. The closer you get to the season, that's when we might start to ramp up conditioning style training.
And I think just off every avatar we've talked about, like I think the importance that we touched on it slightly, but I think every avatar we've talked about off seasons, in season, periodizations, peaking phases. I think the importance of really having that conversation with your client, planning, prioritizing, and then periodizing your program out so that you can allow for maybe 70-30 split for the first 3-4 months, and then as you get closer to whatever season or whatever your sport looks like, well, you're going to bias a bit more of the sports. I think it's just really good to highlight how important that process is when you're taking on clients.
Yes. And I mean, you may even have more than just a 1 year plan. This may be like a 4-year plan to get someone to be at their best, in which case the first 2 years we're really going to bite. If someone has a massive strength deficit, the first 2 years we know that we're going to bias resistance training for the majority of the year, knowing that when the competition time rolls around, we're not going to be at our best. But that's not the goal right now. The goal is 4 years down the line, this 2 years of bias towards resistance training is going to pay dividends. 4 years down the line, that's what we'll be able to express at our absolute best. But of course,
we talked about in our course, about when we had that conversation on periodization, you're essentially just mapping out phases, right? But you could be maybe working with an Olympian. The goal is maybe even it's longer than 4 years. It could be like an 8-year plan to get this individual at their very best to peak at the Olympic Games. So I think just that how important it is to plan, periodize, and prioritize.
Nice. The 3 Ps.
3 Ps.
Awesome, Liam. I think we'll wrap it up there.
Wrapping it up.
Very enjoyable conversation, my friend. Thanks
As
for
always.
joining me and sharing your wisdom and your thoughts. Folks, hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you here next time.
Thank you.